1929. The world cracked open overnight. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange trembled under a storm of voices. Tickers jammed, brokers shouted until their throats burned, and newspapers screamed one headline: Wall Street collapses. People crowded the streets, pressing against locked bank doors, begging to withdraw what was already gone. The air was heavy. Ink, sweat, and fear. But above the chaos, on the upper floors of glass towers, a few offices stayed calm. Men in crisp suits stood by their windows, watching the panic below like surgeons observing an operation. While millions lost everything, they didn't move. They waited. When the world ran, they slowed down. Joseph P. Kennedy was one of them. Before the name became a political dynasty, he was a market predator, patient, calculating, ruthless when he had to be. He understood the rhythm of greed. He knew that every boom hides its own collapse. When the streets were filled with laughter and easy credit, Kennedy was already preparing his exit. He sold while everyone else celebrated, quietly cashing out while the party raged on. People thought he was crazy. The market was flying, fortunes doubling overnight. But he'd seen it before. Too many people making money too easily, too quickly. Then came October. The crash hit like a tidal wave. Prices evaporated, calls failed, men shouted into phones that no longer worked. In a few hours, the illusion of endless growth was gone. Kennedy had already stepped aside, standing in the shadows as the floor fell out beneath the nation. When the dust settled, when the sound of panic turned to silence, he came back with cash in hand. He bought factories, land, and entire companies for pennies. While others prayed for recovery, he purchased it. Later, he summed it up with one simple line: "When the shoeshine boy starts giving stock tips, it's time to sell." It wasn't arrogance, it was observation. When everyone thinks they can't lose, that's when the fall begins. Kennedy didn't need to predict the future. He just listened to the noise until it became unbearable. Across town, another figure was doing the same. Jesse Livermore, the boy plunger. A man who could read a market like a mood. He didn't study charts as much as faces. He watched the crowd, how they breathed, how they hesitated before clicking buy. To him, panic had a scent. Euphoria had a rhythm. In the roaring 20s, while the country drowned in speculation, Livermore began shorting the market. Everyone laughed. Betting against America felt like treason. But Livermore wasn't betting against America. He was betting against delusion. When the crash came, he made what today would be billions. People called him a villain, a vulture feeding on despair. But Livermore's reply was calm. The game never changes, only the players. He was right. The market is just a mirror of human behavior, greed and fear taking turns. Both Kennedy and Livermore understood what most refused to see. Markets aren't built on logic. They're built on emotion, and emotion is predictable. They didn't chase the crowd, they studied it. They didn't hope for luck, they prepared for loss. When everyone else shouted, they listened. When everyone bought, they waited. When everyone prayed, they acted. As the crash wiped out fortunes, they stood apart. No panic, no tears, no broken phones, just quiet execution. In every crisis, there are two kinds of people, those who freeze and those who move. Kennedy and Livermore were the second kind. They didn't see tragedy, they saw transfer. Because money doesn't disappear, it moves. It flows from the impatient to the prepared, from those who trust the noise to those who read the silence. By the time the markets reopened, the same factories, the same assets, the same wealth existed. But the names on the deeds had changed. People called them opportunists, ruthless, heartless. But maybe they were just honest about how the system really works. Crashes don't create winners. They reveal who was ready. They didn't cause the storm. They simply built their shelters early. And when the illusion finally broke, they were already on the other side, calm, waiting, and watching the tide bring everything to them. History remembers the Great Depression as collapse. But for a small circle of men, it was the moment the game reset. While the world wept, they redefined ownership. And that's the hidden rule of every financial disaster. When everyone else loses faith, someone else quietly gains control. They didn't gamble. They adapted. They didn't steal. They survived. They bet that the illusion would break, and they were right. The 1920s looked golden on the surface. Everyone seemed rich, or at least acted like it. Banks offered loans with a smile and a handshake. Credit flowed like champagne, and no one asked who'd be left to clean up the mess. A car on credit, a house on credit, stocks on margin. Everything was for sale, and debt was the currency of dreams. People believed prosperity was permanent. Why save when prices only go up? Why wait when you can borrow tomorrow's money today? Easy money, they called it. And it was. Too easy. The nation was drunk on optimism, dizzy on profits that weren't real. On paper, everyone was winning. But underneath the glitter, cracks began to form. A few men noticed it first, the quiet kind who never believed in forever. Then came 1928. A whisper started making its way through the boardrooms and trading floors. Interest rates were inching up. The cost of borrowing, the oxygen of the boom, was tightening. But no one cared. The party was too loud. The music was still playing. The champagne still flowing. Imagine it. A country dancing on borrowed time. The bankers still lending. The newspapers still cheering. The public still buying more of what they couldn't afford. It's different this time, they said. But it never is. By the summer of 1929, a strange stillness began to settle. Prices wobbled. Traders glanced at each other, half smiling, pretending not to feel the shift in the air. It was like watching storm clouds gather over a beach party, everyone noticing, no one leaving. Then the clock hit October. October 24th, 1929. Black Thursday, the day the music stopped. At first it was just a few sell orders, nothing alarming. Then more, then thousands. The tickers fell behind by hours, unable to keep up with the avalanche. Phones rang until the cords went hot. Men shouted across the floor, papers flying like feathers in a hurricane. Brokers tried to hold the line, but panic spreads faster than logic. Outside, crowds gathered in disbelief. Ordinary people, teachers, shopkeepers, families, stood on the sidewalks staring up at the financial district, as if watching a building burn. The newspapers printed extra editions every hour. Market in chaos! Billions lost! The sound of footsteps echoed through the canyons of Wall Street like drums of retreat. In those hours, the nation's wealth didn't vanish. It evaporated, the same way heat leaves your breath on a cold morning. You can see it one second, gone the next. And just when it seemed like it couldn't get worse, someone turned off the tap. Banks stopped lending. Credit dried up overnight. People rushed to withdraw their savings, but the vaults were empty. Lines stretched around city blocks. Tell the crowd there's no cash, and you can watch faith dissolve in real time. Money, something invisible the day before, suddenly became the only thing that mattered. Without loans, without liquidity, everything froze. Shops closed, factories shut down. Men walked home with empty pockets, wondering how fortune could disappear so fast. It was as if the entire country woke up and found the faucet dry. No water, no flow, just silence. The few who still held cash became kings overnight. Land, businesses, homes, everything was for sale at a fraction of their worth. Panic turned to despair, and despair turned to bargains. The crash didn't destroy wealth. It transferred it to those who had prepared for drought, while others danced in the rain. Then a few years later came the final twist of the knife. 1933. The government issued a simple command: turn in your gold. Citizens lined up at banks, handing over coins and bars they'd saved through the chaos. In return, they got paper, $20.67 for each ounce. They didn't argue. They trusted. But months later, the price of gold was revalued, $35 an ounce. Overnight, the government's holdings jumped in value, while ordinary savers were left staring at their paper, worth less than it was the day before. It wasn't called theft. It was called stabilization, a beautiful word for an ugly truth. The insiders knew before it happened. They moved their gold abroad or hid it in loopholes. They played the same old game, different crisis, same advantage. People said it was for the good of the country. Maybe it was. But it also proved something deeper. In every collapse, morality becomes flexible. Words like fairness and justice bend under the weight of necessity. For those at the top, crisis was never chaos. It was choreography. A reset disguised as reform. The banks consolidated, the government took control of money, and the small man learned a new rule. You can lose everything, and they'll still call it stability. The crash wasn't just about numbers, it was about faith. A test of who believed the system would protect them, and who understood it never would. When the dust settled, the lesson was simple but brutal. When credit dies, cash rules. And when cash rules, those who hold it decide the price of everything, including the future. In the Roaring '20s, money had been infinite. By the '30s, it was air, and most people had stopped breathing. But a few, the ones who saw it coming, were still standing, quietly counting the opportunities hidden inside the wreckage. The faucet would open again one day, and when it did, they'd already owned the pipes. While most of the country was sinking, a small circle of men began to build. They didn't rebuild what was lost. They built something bigger on top of the wreckage. In the silence after the crash, when factories went dark and the air smelled of metal and fear, they moved quietly, buying what others could no longer afford to keep. When others shut their doors, they opened theirs wider. John D. Rockefeller, the oil king who'd already seen 1 century of boom and bust, looked at the Great Depression not as disaster, but as clearance season. Standard Oil and its dozens of offshoots began acquiring broken refineries, shipping companies, and gas stations. While the public searched for jobs, Rockefeller's network was buying their employers. He didn't need to gamble on recovery. He bought the pieces of the economy that would make it inevitable. Across the banking world, J.P. Morgan's empire was doing something similar. As smaller banks collapsed like dominoes, Morgan's firm stood ready to stabilize the system. But stabilization came with signatures. Each rescue was a deal. Mergers, acquisitions, ownership swaps. When frightened investors begged for someone to stop the bleeding, Morgan handed them a contract. By the time the panic eased, the name Morgan wasn't just on a bank. It was on the architecture of American finance itself. They weren't playing the market anymore. They were designing it. Rockefeller bought fuel. Morgan bought faith. When the public needed comfort, they found it under corporate logos that promised stability. The irony was perfect. The same men who profited from collapse now sold the illusion of safety to rebuild trust. Then came Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, one of the richest men in the country. When the crash hit, he famously told President Hoover, "Liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate real estate. Let the rot burn out," he said, "cleanse the system." To most Americans, those words sounded cruel, but Mellon knew exactly what he was doing. His own businesses, aluminum, banking, chemicals, were insulated. As others liquidated, he bought what remained. The purge he prescribed for the nation became fertilizer for his fortune. In Delaware, the DuPont family saw the same pattern, but played a longer game. Their empire began with gunpowder. War and destruction were their business. But they understood that after every war comes reconstruction, and reconstruction needs materials that never go out of demand. They moved from explosives to chemistry, from TNT to nylon. While entire industries collapsed, DuPont invested in the next world: plastics, paint, fibers, the building blocks of modern life. They didn't wait for the future, they manufactured it. By 1932, the government finally intervened, launching the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, or RFC. The newspapers called it Hope. Headlines said, "Billions to save the nation." But money has gravity. It doesn't fall down, it falls up. The loans meant to revive the economy went first to railroads, utilities, and major banks. The same giants that had fueled the bubble were now deemed too important to fail. The small-town banker, the hardware shop owner, the farmer. They were told to be patient. But patience doesn't pay bills. The public saw headlines about relief. The men at the top saw opportunity. With government-backed loans flowing upward, corporations that survived the crash could buy their weaker rivals outright. Consolidation was not a side effect of crisis. It was the purpose. The idea was simple: keep the big ones alive, and they'll carry the rest. The result was simpler still: fewer players, greater power. Somewhere in Ohio, a factory owner stared at a ledger bleeding red. Orders gone, credit frozen, taxes due. He sold his machines to cover his debts. 3 months later, those same machines sat in a warehouse with a new logo: Standard Oil. The factory didn't disappear. It changed owners. That was the invisible hand everyone talked about. Not a guiding force, but a transfer of grip. That's how crises work. They don't destroy assets. They redistribute them, from the over-leveraged to the liquid, from the hopeful to the prepared. And the ones who stay liquid are never the ones making speeches about fairness. One man who understood this better than most was Bernard Baruch. Before the crash, he sold quietly, almost suspiciously early. While others mocked him for leaving the table, he simply said, "I like to leave while they're still pouring drinks." When the markets collapsed, Baruch was sitting on a mountain of cash and government bonds. Within a few years, he became an advisor to Franklin Roosevelt, shaping the policies that rebuilt the country. To the public, he was a patriot, a wise elder helping steer America through chaos. But behind that reputation was timing so precise, it looked like foresight. Baruch never bragged about it. He didn't have to. Power isn't about prediction, it's about position. And he had always positioned himself one step before the fall. By the mid-1930s, the new landscape of wealth was set. Fewer banks, larger corporations, and families whose names would echo for generations. Rockefeller, Morgan, Mellon, DuPont, Baruch. They didn't just survive the Great Depression, they shaped what came after it. The world that emerged was smaller, more centralized, more controlled. You can call it strategy, you can call it instinct. Maybe it was both. But one truth cuts through it all. Crisis doesn't destroy, it edits. It trims the reckless, it rewards the patient. It removes the noise and leaves the structure. While millions fell, a few stood taller. Not because they were lucky, but because they understood what everyone else ignored. In every collapse, value doesn't die. It hides. You just need the cash, the courage, and the coldness to go find it. History books call the Great Depression a tragedy. And for most, it was. But for the few who could wait, who could buy when everyone else sold, it was the greatest sale in modern history. Crisis doesn't break the system, it refines it. It doesn't erase the powerful, it defines them. In the end, every crash is a test of nerve. Those who panic are erased. Those who endure become legends. The Great Depression didn't make new men rich, it revealed which men had been waiting all along. The reckless vanished. The disciplined inherited the ruins. Crashes don't end empires, they concentrate them. Every collapse is a test, not of luck, but of understanding. It strips away illusion and leaves behind the truth about who really knows how the game works. In every crash, there are people who fall because they believed the rules were fair, and people who rise because they knew the rules were written to protect those who wrote them. That's the quiet divide that decides who survives and who starts over. The Great Depression wasn't random. It was a filter. Those who kept their heads, who stayed liquid and patient, found opportunity where others saw ruin. Those who believed recovery was guaranteed, that someone would save them, learned what the market teaches again and again. There are no lifeguards in deep water. Look back at every name that survived: Kennedy, Rockefeller, Morgan, DuPont. They weren't immune to chaos. They just didn't depend on fairness. They played by structure, not emotion. They understood that in every storm, control shifts to those who prepared, before it began to rain. And that brings us to the lesson. The part that's simple enough to write on a napkin, but hard enough that most will ignore it until it's too late. It's not theory, it's not economics. It's what you'd tell your kids at the kitchen table if you wanted them to survive the next time the lights go out. Rule 1. Keep cash. When things fall apart, liquidity isn't just comfort, it's power. Every deal, every opportunity, every bailout starts with the same phrase. Who's still got money? The ones who do get to choose their future while everyone else waits for permission. Cash isn't cowardice, it's ammunition. Rule 2. Own what people can't live without. Energy, food, shelter. The basics never go out of style. The world can digitize, automate, innovate, but no one has figured out how to eat software or sleep inside an algorithm. When demand disappears everywhere else, it stays alive where necessity lives. The people who own essentials never go hungry, even when everyone else does. Rule 3. When the system tightens, don't panic. That's when the noise fades and the real values reveal themselves. During every contraction, people dump what they don't understand. They sell quality for survival. That's the moment the patient buyer wins. The headlines will scream collapse, but underneath, assets are just being handed from the tired to the prepared. Panic is the sale sign of history. Rule 4. Move closer to the source. Every dollar in the world flows from somewhere. A government contract, a supply chain, a credit line. If you're working far from that source, you're fighting gravity. Every year, take one small step closer. A better client, a tighter circle, a partnership nearer to the faucet. Wealth doesn't travel far from where it's created. The closer you stand, the less you have to chase. Those 4 rules aren't complicated. They sound almost boring. But that's the trick. The game rewards the disciplined, not the dramatic. The men who walked out of the Great Depression richer than they entered didn't predict the future. They respected patterns. They moved slowly when others rushed, and they stayed when others fled. Crisis isn't chaos. It's calibration. It measures who was overextended and who was waiting. It doesn't care about fairness. It cares about fitness. It punishes noise and rewards preparation. So when the next shock comes, and it will, remember this. The system doesn't break, it resets. And when it does, the rules will be the same as they've always been. Hold what's real. Protect liquidity. Ignore the noise. Move a little closer to the source. Simple? Yes. Easy? Never. But it's worked for 100 years and it will work for 100 more, because the rhythm of money never changes. Only the players do. War arrived before the dust of the Depression had even settled. The factories that once stood silent roared back to life, not for peace, but for production. The government needed hands that could build, machines that could supply, and men who could deliver. Rockefeller's oil fueled the engines of the Allied armies. DuPont's chemicals turned into gunpowder and synthetic fibers for uniforms. Ford's assembly lines, once making cars, now rolled out tanks and trucks by the thousands. The same names that had survived the crash now powered the war. When the smoke cleared and peace returned, they hadn't lost anything, they had gained more. Contracts became monopolies. Wartime necessity became peacetime influence. The men who supplied the fight now supplied the future. They didn't rebuild from ruin, they built on top of it. The war ended, but the structure it created didn't. In 1944, a quiet conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, redrew the map of money. The dollar became the world's anchor. The American financial elite, the same bloodlines that had thrived through collapse and war, now set the rules for the planet. The Great Depression had humbled nations, but it had crowned the United States, and within it, the same small circle of families who always managed to stay closest to the source. Decades passed, new industries rose, old ones reinvented themselves, but the rhythm never changed. In 2008, it was the banks. Too big to fail, they merged, absorbed, expanded. The crash that should have destroyed them made them stronger. In 2020, it was the tech giants. While small businesses closed their doors, the platforms grew. Every crisis, every reset, followed the same choreography. Panic below, consolidation above. The names change, the tools evolve, the story repeats. That's the hidden music of capitalism. Each fall creates fewer, larger players, and each recovery makes them harder to challenge. We like to believe the market rewards fairness, that hard work guarantees stability, that discipline ensures safety. But the truth is colder. The market rewards understanding. It pays those who see the patterns early and punishes those who mistake noise for structure. It doesn't care about fairness. It only breathes through timing. Most of us live inside that breath without noticing it. We borrow when credit is cheap, we panic when it dries, and we call it fate when things fall apart. But for those who learn to listen, to the silence between expansions, to the pauses before the panic, crisis sounds less like disaster and more like opportunity. If you look at your own life, the same rhythm applies. If interest rates doubled tomorrow, how long could you last before selling something you love? If the money in your account lost half its value overnight, what would you still own that mattered? And the question that matters most, are you on the side of the flow that gives or the side that takes? These aren't economic questions. They're survival questions. Every system, financial, political, personal, tests its participants the same way. Who adapts and who waits for someone else to fix it? History has never been kind to those who wait. The faces of power may have changed, but the logic hasn't. Rockefeller's oil became Amazon's servers. DuPont's chemicals became Silicon Valley's code. Morgan's banks became digital platforms moving trillions at the click of a button. The product changes. The law remains. Proximity equals power. Those who stay close to the source survive the storms. Every crash is a mirror. It shows us what we've built and what we've borrowed. It shows who we are when the lights go out. Some rebuild, some remember. Most forget, until the next one hits. History never repeats exactly. It just finds new actors to play the same parts, the same script, different decade, the same rule, different currency. Crises don't erase wealth, they rearrange it. When the next one comes, and it always does, it won't look like the last. It never does. But if you listen closely, the rhythm will be familiar. The panic, the silence, the slow return of confidence. It's the same dance, played in a new key. And when it happens again, the world will ask, how could this happen? And somewhere, someone will answer quietly, it never stopped happening. Crises don't destroy wealth. They only change who holds the keys. That's the silent law of money. A single coin falls to the floor, spinning slowly before it stops. The sound fades and everything is quiet again, until the next spin begins.